Gentlemen, it's Justin Johnson. We're on our academic integrity of module A225, block 1, Arts and Humanities. On Infancy of Today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, broaden your horizon. You want to have a vision. You need to make sacrifices. You need a methodical approach at anything you do at life. If it's in your studies, trying to gain wisdom, knowledge, and integrity. It takes focus. It takes discipline. It's like anything, isn't it? Sports. To be a champion in your sports, to get triumph in your sports, takes discipline, practice, methodical practice. So we're here today on academic integrity. We move into a new system of things, changing our direction. We want to know where the book's published. When you read, also make sure you record your reading. You can always listen back over your notes. On block 1, Ambition and Anxiety, edited by Paul Lawrence. This book was first published at the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes. We're on page 68. Industrial Revolution, Unit 2. Generally, many tasks performed by men come to be seen skilled by semi-skilled regardless of complexity, while work performed by women and children was rarely identified as such. As a result, there were quite sharp differences in pay between men and women. Figures are hard to find. But Maximum Berg quotes figures from the traveller Arthur Young from 1741 to 1820 on average wage for women workers in Birmingham in the early 19th century of 7 shilling a week, which was the minimum for a male labourer, who could earn up to £3. In the button trade, male toolmakers who supervised the work might earn 30 to 40 shillings, while the women who were employed for piercing and cutting work earned 8 to 12 shillings, and girls just 6 to 8 shillings. Berg, 1994. Note these figures are in old currency, in which there were 12 pence in a shilling and 20 shillings to a pound. 7 shillings would be 35 pence in new currency. 30 to 40 shillings would be £1.50 to £2, and 8 to 12 shillings would be 40 to 60 pence. To convert these wages into current prices, use the link provided on the website module. This is very, very good that we're going to put into my book, because it says about men workers making tools. The first ever profession in the world was tool making. Very significant in Bible and historical studies. In evaluating the nature of industrialisation in Birmingham, historians have on occasion contrasted it with that of Lancashire. Thus, as in reading 2.1, the continued importance of hand tools has been emphasised, as has the reliance of a skilled labourer. The manually powered tools described in this text, press, stamp, lathe and drill, were in so long before the classic period of industrialisation and continued to be used in the same ways into the 1820s and 1830s, when power from steam engines began to be applied. This can be contrasted with the importance of new power-driven machinery in the development of the textile industry in Lancashire. The textile industry also come to rely on a large workforce of semi or unskilled workers serving machinery, many of whom were women and children, while skilled male manual labour remained at the centre of much of the production in Birmingham and the surrounding area. Here, often, each workman remained judge of his own performance, and small workshops remained much more common than mills and factories that came to represent Lancashire. This contrast should not be exaggerated. There were many skilled workers in Lancashire who continued to use hand-powered tools, such as hand bloom weavers, who were in demand between the mechanisation of spinning around 1800 and much slower introduction of power looms for weaving in 1820s and 1830s. Equally, in Birmingham's metals industry, manufacturers continued experiment with their machinery until 1850. The city produced more patents than anywhere else in the UK except London in Berg 1994. In both Lancashire and West Midlands, furthermore, there was a mixture of small and large firms whose relationships were controlled by market relations. And in Birmingham too, some parts of some processes, such as the burnishing, piercing, and hand painting of buttons, come to be identified as suitable for female labour, with large numbers of women and girls employed. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that industrialisation in Birmingham was different from that in Lancashire, and in particular lacked the dramatic changes that resulted from major advances in technology. Change in Birmingham was more about scale and intensity. Many of the products there had long been produced in the area. Gun production, for instance, went back to the 17th century. In contrast to with Lancashire in Birmingham, there was no stage when reliance on mortar power meant factories were best located in countryside beside fast rivers. There was a split between iron production, which needed to be based near supplies of first charcoal and later coal in Staffordshire and Shropshire. The metal goods that were produced in Birmingham itself, but Birmingham were made throughout a centre of manufacturing, the fastest growing industry town in England in the 18th century. It was this that justified the description of the city of Arthur Young as the first manufacturing town in the world. A description by Eric Hopkins in the title of his book on industrialisation in Birmingham, Hopkins, 1989. 18th century Birmingham, therefore, did not see a revolution in how things were made, so much as an acceleration of production as demand rose. Yet this, too, results in change. One aspect of this concerned the division of labour within and between firms. Work was heavily subdivided in many of Birmingham industries, as following description makes clear. And Pine Works in Birmingham in 1810 divided the production process in 13 different operations. The wire was drawn out to a proper size by a simple engine. It was straightened by another machine. It was cut into lengths. The end of its lengths were pointed by means of a wheel. These were cut again, each wire forming several pins. The wire was twisted by means of a wheel. The twisted wires were cut into heads. The heads were softened in a fire. The heads were put on by hand. The pins were washed. They were then boiled in a liquor of tartar and tin, dried, and finally they were prepared by children. The work involved a high degree of division of labour, with different workers responsible for each operation. In this case, this was all done within one firm, but elsewhere different production stages might be carried out by different firms. For instance, a gunmaker was not in fact a manufacturer, but an entrepreneur who marketed gun and made foreign parts produced by a range of craftsmen, each specialising in one part of the gun and known collectively as material men. And it's then assembly by setters up trade directories for the second quarter of the 19th century list of over 30 distinct trades related to the manufacture of guns in Hopkins 1989. The skilled nature of such of the work in Birmingham meant that workmen long retained control of the work process themselves. 18th century Birmingham was notorious for the observance of St. Monday, in which a day of freedom at the beginning of the week preceded a rush towards the end of the week to finish jobs by deadlines, unlike in factories where hours were dedicated by machines and employers. Workmen also played a major role in controlling entry to trade since, although formal apprenticeships seem to have been comparatively rare, skills were learned by boys and young men working together with skilled older ones. This was mentioned by Berg 1994. Even in large factories, each section might carry out different tasks, and employers focused attention on ensuring that men developed special skills in the operation they worked on. We're going to look at the exercise it asks us to do. What might B. Advantages and disadvantages for workers of deploying great expertise in one task. Reflect on this question and jot down your answer. Specialisation meant that workers were valuable to employers and command high rates of pay. It could, however, also mean they were tied into one employer or industry and so could suffer in the demand for their skills fell due to the fluctuations in the business cycle or technological change. In some cases, where the division of labour was very great, they might effectively be de-skilled because their specialisation was so narrow it could be used in only one workplace. This seems to be the case in Burnham Pine works described above. So you get students that are, learning through college. They're learning with new technologies of what's coming in for the system. So they're working with different classes of people who get um, skilled worker in that trade. They don't learn the new technology as a trainee, young student working as a working their way up. They're also educating the adults as the adults are educating the young youth today coming through the system of things. One view of the subdivision of work prevailing in Birmingham has gone further, arguing that the high skill levels and the multiplicity of business create opportunity for skilled workers to become independent niche producers and even to rise to become small masters who employed others. Clive Behag, however, has argued that this independence was being undermined by the 1820s and 1830s as a prolonged slump in prices forced producers to cut costs. Trades come to be dominated by men known as factors who connected the different manufacturers by buying and selling both the raw materials and the finished products, and who were therefore able to set prices, especially for small producers who were dependent on weekly credit. Large producers also used small ones in their attempts to manage demand, farming out work when there was more than they could cope with, by keeping it in house when possible. Or small producers might be used for part of a process that was otherwise based in larger establishments. In this world, self-employment become a means of exploitation, with independent workers losing control of the price and pace of their work, but still bearing the cost of providing work tools and a risk of fluctuations in trade. This was mentioned by Behag in 1990. Commercial travellers in some industry regions consist of clusters of specialised producers all making the same sort of goods. How did they get these goods to markets? Here, factors and commercial travellers were key. As explained above, factors might be important in organising production among small producers, such as in Burnham. Their second function was to market, whereas for this, factors needed commercial travellers who toured the UK collecting orders for the products of an industrial region where a certain type of goods was made. 72. Historian Andrew Pop explores this world using the Journey books, compiled between 1810 and 1815 by a Wolverhampton factoring firm. John Shaw and Co. At first, John Shaw, 1782 to 1858, appears to have travelled himself. Later, he also employed travellers. The journey books show two regular journeys being made from Wolverhampton, each taking place twice a year and lasting up to 8 weeks. The longer of the two described as the Kendal journey took Shaw and later his travellers up through North Staffordshire, Cheshire and Lancashire as far as Kendal in the Lake District, and then back via Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield. The second, shorter Salop journey took in Shropshire, North East Wales, Liverpool and South Lancashire. These journeys, presumably all made by post coaches, were demanding. The February 1810 Kendal journey, for example, involved visits to 73 customers in 34 towns and cities over 7 weeks and dealt with accounts worth of £1,080. By 1850, the same journey was regularly worth more than 5,000, a pop 2007. Shoreham was selling the metal goods for which Wolverhampton was famous, and about half the customers visited were ironmongers, but other includes a range of other shopkeepers and also manufacturers and wholesaler merchants. This was mentioned by Pop 2009. Many customers were visited regularly. The purpose of the tours was to solicit new orders and to settle accounts. Both required the development of a relationship based in trust, especially since long running credit terms were common. At the same time, Shaw clearly wanted to widen his customer base. Annotations in later journey books show that new customer could be problematic. One of the 1814 book notes a new customer promising to pay something next journey. While in another case, the customer could not be found on return visit, quoted in Pop 2007. The journey book finishes in 1815, but we know from the letters between Shaw and his wife that the following years were difficult for them, and the post war slump meant many customers ran up big debts. The other end of factoring operation was the warehouse in Wolverhampton. New orders constantly arrived by letters and goods had to be sourced from local suppliers. Here too, trust was important. Shaw needed to know that goods could be produced when required, but he also needed to have confidence in their quality. It was important that they were delivered safely and on time, especially since some were required for particular events such as trade fairs. When Shaw was travelling, he frequently wrote to his employers and also his wife for assurance that all was well with the warehouse. In Pop 2012, later he took on a partner, but his wife remained deeply involved in his business. This was common in many small businesses and is another way that work might be gendered, although the firm was known as John Shaw and Co. We know from the correspondence between John and Elizabeth Shaw that they were both well aware that it was in fact joint enterprise in which each filled a contemporary role. In the activity 2.2 on page 73 on regions and industrialisation, now go to the module website and complete activity 2.2. Why the Industrial Revolution happened. This takes around 30 minutes. West of Scotland. You have seen that Birmingham and the Black Country was established centre of manufacturing before the Industrial Revolution indeed. What is striking is that it retained its lead, successfully adapting to change and remaining one of the most vibrant economic regions in the UK. I'd now like to turn to an area that was long peripheral to the British economy, the west of Scotland. And at the time of the Act of Union 707, Scotland was a much poorer country than England. With what little industry there was based in the eastern lowlands around Edinburgh, the Union removed most trade barriers between the two countries. But at first, the Scottish extractive, while the main manufacturing industry, linen, was supported by government subsidies for exports, Divine 2012. Over time, however, unrestricted trade with England, and especially free access to the English colonies in America, did begin to work in favour of the Scottish economy and especially the port of Glasgow, which flourished as a trading centre, particularly in tobacco. Turn to reading 2.2. John Snodgrass, Statistical Account of Scotland, Description of Paisley, 1719-99, located at the end of the unit. This gives an account of development of the textile industry in the 18th century in Paisley, the major town in Renfrewshire, a county just south and west of Glasgow. The reading is taken from the old statistical account of Scotland, a monumental work compiled at the instigation of Sir John Sinclair, 1754 to 1835, which can be seen as part of the drive to document society introduced in Unit 1 and discussed further in Unit 4. The statistical account includes descriptions of every parish in Scotland, most of them written by the local minister. Reading 2.2 now, you may wish to jot down a few notes that you read and the answer the following question. To what does the writer attribute the undoubted success of the local manufacturing industry. This is a very positive amount of development of Paisley, which highlights the contribution of the producers whose spirit of manufacture is twice praised. Other factors listed included the skill of the craftsman, the low cost of labour, and English influence. In the discussion, although the word spirit sounds old fashioned, there can be no doubt that the Paisley manufacturers show considerable enterprise and ability in seeking out new profitable branches of textiles. The development of higher quality products, including cotton blends, and the introduction of thread manufacturers, silk manufacture, and the later switch to muslin as examples. Cotton was to become the main textile product in the 1790s and 1800s. But other factors were important too, because when fresh wire and has been the centre of textiles for some time, it possessed a core of skilled workers. Yet Scotland was still a poorer country than England, and labour there was cheaper. While immigration from the Highlands and Ireland also kept wages down, the link to England was important both in terms of the influx of manufacturers, such as the silk weavers, from Spitalfields in London, and in terms of markets. Paisley's early success was thus built on English connection. Finally, another factor that was to become important in 20 years after this text was written should be mentioned: the wars with France, which cut trade with the continent and protected British manufacturers from European competition, both at home and in the Americas. The next stage in the development of the Scottish textile industry also followed the English example. From the 1770s onwards, some manufacturers in North England and later Scotland began to build large mills to house the new spinning frames. The first powered machinery to spin cotton. Cotton was a tough but supple fibre and worked better in machine spinning than flax or silk did. At first, these mills needed to build near fast flowing rivers to benefit from their water power, and so were often sited in rural locations. In 1788, within 17 years of Richard Arkwright, 1732-1792, establishing his first mill at Cromford in Derbyshire. There was 143 water-powered mills in Britain, of which 19 were in Scotland. Watley 2000. By the mid-1790s, the area around Paisley had over 40 large cotton mills mentioned in Nebspit 2009. The early spinning mills are among the most spectacular buildings of the first decades of the Industrial Revolution. Several are still standing today, so it is possible to emphasise how large that they must have seemed in an age when most of the buildings with an economic purpose were still small scale. One of the most iconic in New Lanark, shown in figures 2.7, which was built by the Falls of Clyde below the small town of Lanark in Lancashire. New Lanark became famous for its size. In 1816, it employed 1,700 people, and for the progressive views on education and social organisation of its manager, Robert Owen, 1771 to 1858. Like many of the mills, New Lanark employed many children because they were seen as better suited to factory discipline. Its rural location meant that a factory village needed to be built, and Owen also constructed a schoolhouse for the children. New Lanark was to become the most famous mill in Scotland and is now an UNESCO World Heritage Site. If spinning comes to be increasingly dominated by large power-driven mills, this was not the case for another other main process in producing cotton textiles, weaving, although experiments with factory weaving were carried out from around 1800 onwards. Most weaving continued to be done by hand-loom weavers, working in their own homes, partly because their finer yarns used in Scotland cotton products were not well suited to machine spinning, and partially because the low wages paid to the hand-loom weavers undercut factory production by around 1840. There were almost 85,000 hand-loom weavers in Scotland. Watley 1997, although thereafter the process was rapidly replaced by factory weaving, throwing at the hand and weavers out of work, both in the switch to mill spinning and the continued importance of hand loom weaving. When Frewshire mirrored Lancashire, but there were also differences from around 1800s onwards. Steam engines increasingly used to power mills in Lancashire, meaning new ones could be built in urban locations. This happened less in Scotland, where in 1835 and total of 43.6% of energy was still supplied by water power compared with just 18.6% in England, suggests Watley in 2000. Stuart Nesbitt argues that one reason for this was the use of long lathes to bring water power into towns, mentioned Nesbitt 2009 again. Women also formed a high proportion of the labour force in the Scottish cotton industry. At its height, the Scottish industry concentrated on highly quality products than Lancashire. But as Lancashire began to move into these areas too, when Frewshire found competition difficult and lost market share. On the other hand, it retained specialisms in pattern cloths and in the production of cotton thread throughout the 19th century. As Scotland's cotton became to an end, industrial leadership passed to the coal, iron, and energy industries. The iron industry was first slow to develop. Even the discovery that were extensive in iron deposits in North Lancashire near the coalfields did not change this, because the quality of local coal was such that the iron smelted was weak and brittle. It was only the invention of hot blast smelting by James Nelson, 1790 to 1865 in the late 1820s, involving very hot airing being blasted in a smelting process that the quality of the iron was raised. A patent was taken out and experimentation continued. Soon temperatures of 300 Celsius were reached, with an improvement in both the quality and the quantity of iron produced and reduction in the amount of coal needed. With these new values, the price of Scottish pig iron on the Liverpool Exchange fell by almost a third to a price below that of Staffordshire, Slaven 1975. Between 1830 and 1845, Scotland's share of British iron outposts rose by 5% to 25%. During the middle decades of the 19th century, concern at the social cost of industrialisation mounted, and the British government became increasingly anxious to gather knowledge on issues. You learn about this unit on Unit 4. One solution was to get set up a Royal Commission, a type of parliamentary inquiry to investigate conditions and collect evidence as a basis for legislation, with commissioners appointed to report on specific problems or areas. The evidence from these Royal Commissions is one of the major sources of the century. Thomas Tansford Report to the Children's Employment Commission, 1842, located at the end of the unit, is an extract from evidence provided to the one of these commissions on the employment of children in case Tansford, 1808-1880, was working for the Royal Commission on Employment of Children in Mines and Manufactures, which led to legislation 1842 and 1843. As you will see, Tansford did not confine his interest exclusively to the official subjects of his inquiry. Study and read in 2.3 now and then answer the following question. How does Tansford link the social condition he finds in Coatbridge with the development of the industry? Tansford is clearly appalled by Coatbridge, most obviously by the social conditions. He goes on later into his report to write about children, but also the industrial environment, which he describes as in dramatic terms. Blazing volcanoes. However, he does not criticise the industry or industrialists. His focus is on the poor living conditions, which he attributes partly to the rapid increase in population and partly to the lack of moral direction. His starting point is woefully inadequate provision of churches, and he goes on to note that lack of middle class leadership. Tansford's perspective is typical of the many middle class observers who visited industrial regions in the first half of the 19th century and reflect a great anxiety about the social, political, and environmental consequences of industrialisation. Coatbridge iron industry was linked to Glasgow first by the Monklands Canal, which Tansford describes in reading 2.3, and then by railways. Glasgow developed engineering and shipbuilding industries, which relied on cheap iron. The River Clyde had not previously been a major shipbuilding area and now become an early centre of experimentation in both iron built and steamships. By the 1840s, two-thirds of steamships built in Britain were built there. Slave in 1975 to page in the second half of the 18th century, the iron and engineering complex of industries on Clydeside far more than the Wren freshware textiles industry become the core of Scotland's industrial development, yet both industrials shared certain features that their very rapid development, their reliance on cheap labour and the export of orientation is this. Scotland has more in common with other late industrialisers than with England. Like the European countries which industrialised a little later in the century, Scotland was playing catch up from the start with the benefits and pitfalls of the situation. Thus, Scotland was able to first benefit to borrow techniques and inventions. Although later it contributed inventions too, such as Nelson hot blast smelting process, it was also able to benefit from the larger and richer English market for its industrial products. Yet the initial impetus came from exploiting its resources in terms of both of its natural endowments. Water, power, coal, iron, and its people. For employers, lower wages meant lower costs and were an essential element in their success. The West Country and Wales. In examining Birmingham, region of the west of Scotland, I focused on two areas and that did industrialise. If between different routes, was clearly no single template for industrialisation. While these different regions differed in the paths they took in industrial development, they did both achieve a significant industrial success. There are regions, however, that did not develop in the same way. In this section, I will look briefly at the West Country and Wales. The former seemed set for industrialisation, but manufacturing in fact declined, while in the latter industrial development remained confined to a few small areas. These examples show how the term industrial revolution conceals the very marked regional differences. In the first half of the 18th century, the woolen industry in the countries of Gloucestershire, Wiltshire, and Somerset was as prominent as the West Yorkshire, yet by 1800, and around 60% of the national wool production was in Yorkshire. Hudson, 1990, to page 116. As the Yorkshire woolen industry developed, that in the West Country declined. A major reason given by historians is that two industries were organised differently. In West Yorkshire, where there were many small masters, each had different incentive to develop their own business by adopting new methods. In the West Country, by contrast, manufacturing was dominated by gentlemen clothiers, who brought the raw wool and then supervised the various processes to turn the wool into cloth, but retained ownership of the wool throughout. Some of the early parts of the process took place in the clothier's own workshops, but for the first spinning and the weaving and putting out a system was used in which the wool of yarn was sent for processing to independent workers who worked in their own homes. The final stages, such as dyeing, might again take place in the clothier's workshops or might again be put out. Finally, the finished cloth was sold to the merchants who marketed it in London. Adrian Randall has argued that this system gave no sufficient knowledge or incentive to adopt new methods. The system worked well for the existing clothiers and it required considerable capital to set up as a new one. Most other participants in the system possessed expertise in only one part of the production process. Spinners and weavers were entirely dependent on the clothiers who provided them with work. Finally, the clothlers were alarmed by a resistance they encountered when they tried to introduce new machinery. Randall highlights that the workers in the Western country woolen industry who lived in the industrial towns and villages were there as a new other employment, proved adept at resisting introduction of machines that might take away their work. Randall, 1989. As will be explored in Unit 3, machine breaking aid and other forms of resistance to new ways of working were widespread in Britain in the early 19th century.